Just so you know, Matt, there's people listening right now that are probably getting angrier and angrier as you talk.
When you start with that idea, it's never going to be where you kind of finish with it, especially in games.
When kind of it came clear internally that a third edition was going to get worked on, can you give us an idea what some of the early goals were? Is there any early concepts or ideas that ended up getting dropped when you either before you started testing or through testing?
It's going to summon its keyword models. They're going to be balanced around it, but everyone's going to play nice.
But there's another big change in hiring, and I want to get a sense of where this started and why it's still there. Not that I don't think it should be, but how it survived from the initial idea, and that's hiring a master.
There are few things better than stepping away from the screens, unplugging and sitting around a table to do battle with your friends. Every week, Third Floor Wars brings you the latest strategies, tactics, and reviews on board games, card games, and miniature games like Malifaux. If you want useful information on the games you already play, or new insights on great games other people are playing, you are in the right place. Craig and Ray welcome you to the Third Floor and the Tabletop Talk broadcast.
Craig here on the Third Floor, and today we have a very special guest from Wyrd's design team, Matt Carter. Now, the newest edition of Malifaux has been announced, and it's going to be releasing here in late June. So what could be better than picking the brain of someone involved in the development, design, and testing? So, Matt, welcome to the Third Floor.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
Oh, glad to have you, man. Now, for those who have not really interacted with you that much, Matt, can you give us a little bit of background as far as, how you ended up coming to Wyrd, how you ended up being a game designer for Wyrd?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in that I've been playing games since I was a really little kid with my family, and started playing minis games when I was something like 11 or 12.
Wow.
And going on from there, I somehow fell into, in college, I went into a game design degree, and I don't know really how I got there. And then eventually I was like, I'm doing tabletop games as a degree. And I was like, what is happening? And that kind of finished up. I was like, okay, what do I do now? And I'd been playing Malifaux back in 1.5, really, really early 2. And I was contacted by one of my friends, and he was like, oh, Wyrd's looking for another designer. I was like, cool. I mean, I have no chance in hell in doing anything like that. I haven't played the game in a while, and I'm just fresh out of college. And then it just kind of fell into my lap from there. I got to know all the guys, and everyone seemed to really like me. So it's one of those things that, if you work at it and you consider yourself good at the kind of the hobby and can really get into things, you can kind of take it from any direction. I consider myself very lucky, but yeah, in terms of just being on the Wyrd game design team, I would say it more fell into my lap than anything. But
well, just so you know, Matt, there's people listening right now that are probably getting angrier and angrier as you talk, because there's a lot of people that would go, boy, how cool is that? Go to college for game design, work for a company like Wyrd and make cool games. So good for you, man. Yeah,
it's definitely one of those things that when I was getting my degree, I was like, I'm not going to do anything with this, but at least I'm enjoying my time here in college. And then kind of went from there, and yeah, it's been working out great. Been here for almost 2 years now. So
that's great, dude. That's great. Now, out of curiosity, for somebody who plays a lot of games but has never designed a game, and of course, everybody who plays a lot of games thinks they can design a game. But as I think anybody who's spent any time with games over a longer period of time understands that there's a big difference between the two. I'd be curious, though, as far as getting a degree in it. Like, if you were to say one or two big takeaways, like what opened your eyes in college going to school for that?
Honestly, a lot of it was being able to look past every idea that you have, as you kind of learn that everything is not as good as you think it is, which is really basic advice that a lot of people will pick up. But like, when you start with that idea, it's never going to be where you kind of finish with it, especially in games. And especially with Malifaux and working on a team, you kind of have to give up specific things that you're like, oh, I really, really love this. But sometimes you have to do what's best for the game, the team as a whole, and be like, okay, I'm going to give up on that one minor thing to make the game better because, I'm only one person. And if you're playing a game with hundreds and hundreds of people, it really makes a big difference. So
I would imagine it'd be easy to get married to something and really kind of fall in love with it. And that has got to be tough to let go.
Yeah, it definitely is. But at the same time, once you do it 100 times over the course of college, you're like, okay, I can look past any idea. And once you write down essentially 500 ideas for something, you'll eventually get one that everyone kind of agrees on that's good, but it's never the first one.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, you guys have several games and products out there, but I think what I want to do, Matt, is focus on Malifaux, just because we are really on the cusp of the newest release of 3rd edition. And what I was hoping to do is kind of pull the curtain back a little bit. And for a lot of us, a new edition of a game is stressful. It's confusing. It seems like things are just happening. But, this has been a part of your life for a while now. So when kind of it came clear internally that a 3rd edition was going to get worked on, can you give us an idea what some of the early goals were, really even before the process started?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came in right at the very cusp of working on 3rd edition. Basically, I sat down and they were like, all right, we're doing this. And I was like, okay. And so we kind of went over what we really wanted to work on with 2nd edition going into 3rd. And the big thing that kept coming up was thematic crews. And that has been one of the things that's carried on, hopefully pretty well, in that playing a game of Malifaux, it never felt right to see something like Rasputina running with a whole bunch of fire gamemen, which doesn't necessarily happen in 2nd edition. But the idea of thematic unity on a table looks really good from an outsider's perspective, as well as it feels really good makes you get really invested in the characters in the individual game. And that was basically the biggest core concept that we wanted to go forward with. There were a bunch of others. One of the things that we really pushed for was accessibility and clarity within 3rd edition. A lot of 2nd edition had slight variations on how something was worded, or a whole bunch of things that were very, very similar but slightly different. And so we wanted to rein a lot of those things in. And then working on reinvigorating some of our older models that didn't see a lot of play or were considered bad or underutilized. And then obviously just trying to make the game more fun in general. To us, it's a game, so it should be fun to play in every way. So.
Yeah, and boy, that's cool that was an early concept, because if there's something that I have been, screaming at the top of the hill about is, I think the keyword system where you guys ended up to kind of meet that goal. I love it. And I'm hearing a lot of feedback here in the North Carolina meta and online that I'm not the only one. Even some of the guys in the UK that I talked to are really getting a kick out of it for all the reasons you listed. So, hats off on that, man, because I think that you guys really, really did a great job there. And I would imagine from a design perspective, it's going to simplify balancing going forward. Do you think that's a reasonable assumption?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The whole idea of balancing things based on keywords kind of has a trickle down effect into everything that we do. especially when it comes to like when we want to introduce a new model. It makes it a lot easier to introduce a 4 Soulstone scheme runner for something like Pandora, if she doesn't have to compete with the Terratot all the time, because the Terratot is suddenly more expensive. And along with that, it is just more fun to play and have things that look as part of your crew. So the thematic unity just has this huge trickle down effect into basically every decision for the first few months of 3rd edition. So
that's good. And it's kind of what I'm hoping to see. And of course, none of us know, including you, really what this is going to look like in 6 months when it's, really gotten full release and competitive play has happened. I mean, that's when stuff, pops up. Right. But I think out of the gate, what I'm excited about is the kind of the death of what I called the all-star crews, which was, for some factions more than others, but you had a situation where the person would change their master, but their crew wouldn't change that much. They kind of, figured out the best models for the price and for the pool, and you would run the same 3 or 4 or 5 models regardless of what master. And that breaks that thematic, part that you've been talking about. I'm really optimistic that the keyword system is going to do a good job with that. So that's cool. So that's an early concept, Matt, that you guys ran with, and really, ended up, sticking. I'm curious, is there any early concepts or ideas, that ended up getting dropped when you, either before you started testing or through testing?
Yeah, absolutely. There's tons. There's tons of things that we kind of threw out that got put on the cutting room floor. The one that I still think about that I would have loved to have done, but it just really didn't work, ties into keywords a bit more. With 3rd edition, we have a lot of keyword abilities that tie across the models. And the original concept behind that was that the models didn't really have this ability on them, and it instead was on its own card, and it was kind of linked to whatever master you chose. So that essentially, if you're playing Karis, not everyone needs to have all of the Karis keyword abilities written on their card, but instead, all of these things are just on one single edition.
Interesting.
Yeah. The problem,
so like a keyword guide almost.
Yeah, almost like a keyword guide. And originally, it did a couple other things. It would provide new abilities. It could give you bonuses, have specific effects during hiring, a whole bunch of different things. And just really, really early basic internal play testing showed that it was a little confusing, and it lost a lot of the theme of the individual models. And it made all of the models really, really complicated. Yep. And so it just had a lot of things to remember. And so that idea was pitched a couple months in.
Yeah, I could see some, why it would have been attractive, though, because, if you wanted to make a major shift to an entire keyword, you change one card. And, suddenly it's a seismic change across multiple models. But at the same time, having to refer to 2 different cards for every model is kind of a pain in the behindicus. So that's interesting. I'm going to have to soak in that for a little while, because there's things I like about it, but I definitely could see why it got dropped. How about something that survived this process, but really changed a lot? So is there something you can think of that you guys talked about early that, it's still, we can still see the remnants of that initial idea, but it changed a good bit?
Yeah, there's one that the core, not necessarily function, but how it kind of looks in 3rd edition compared to when we originally started with it, was actually summon upgrades. That was one of those things that was a pretty early design idea that we had. Looking back at how Sandeep worked in 2nd edition, we really liked that. It brought a lot of flavor to the individual models. And originally, there were a lot more restrictions on how they worked, and they were going to be a bit more open. But a lot of what they are still kind of shown to be now is generally like a plentiful number, which kind of restricts how many you can hire of that one single upgrade. And that's one of the few things that has been kind of consistent is just limiting the number of summons a model can do based on the number of upgrades they have. But how the models look, how the upgrades look, has changed kind of dramatically. And minor amounts of those, the flavor that we kind of lost on some of those were added in the tail end of the open beta, just to bring a bit more flavor and have less blank cards. A good example of that is Sandeep's Shackled Elements with Our Powers Combined ability. That was added as a way to just have less pure blank text on a card and bring a bit more flavor, as well as bring together some of his initial designs forward and have a bit more fun with it. So.
God, the fact that you can remember any of this, Matt, off the top of your head after being buried in it blows my mind. Because I have trouble just remembering the 5 or 10 models I put on the board, let alone every model out there. So hats off to you on that one. So guys, we're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, I want to pick Matt's brain and learn a little bit more about the process of testing a new edition. Some of us have play tested before. Some of us have watched play testing happening. I really want to get a sense of what it's like to be, in the designer's chair while the testing's happening. So we'll be right back. Howdy folks, Craig here. Now if you love gadgets as much as we do, you're going to love the new Third Floor Wars Gadget Bundle from Schooner Labs. Branded with the logo of your favorite podcast, it comes with 2 measuring multi-tools, a compass stepper for those tight and important movements, along with a compact dashboard to track your turn, strat, and scheme scoring along with your soul stones and pass tokens. It is the perfect bundle for anyone who plays Malifaux or just wants to look cool while doing it. The link is in the show notes. Check them out and help support your favorite gaming podcast. Okay, so now that we kind of got an idea of, where Malifaux 3rd edition kind of started, I think it was really interesting, Matt, to hear, how some things evolved and how some things died, but at some point, things get outside of lofty goals and theory, and you have to start testing it. And the one thing that I want to start off with is learning about internal testing. So testing that you guys did in the office, without anybody from the outside, what does that process look like?
It's weirdly complicated, but really easy sometimes. So 3rd edition in its very, very early alpha was just 2nd edition with all the models were basically the same. And we just kind of put atop a slightly different core rule set. And we're like, let's see how this goes. So some of the newer kind of core concepts like 1 AP actions and lowering down some conditions, those kind of things. We essentially took all the M2E models and just made a 3rd edition version of them. And we're like, let's see how this goes from here. And we'll kind of work through the core mechanics of the game. And then we'll really deep dive in each individual keyword. And so a lot of it was kind of just going back and forth in the design room and talking about whether or not we liked an ability. And so like charge as a whole, being a 1 AP action, actually came. We came up with the idea because we wanted to do to lessen the strain of the game and make it a little bit easier by just having single actions. But charge was the really potent 2 AP action. Right. And so we're like, if we made it a 1 AP action, how would that game go? And so we just kind of wrote down a 5-minute version of just like move and attack once. And we were like, okay. And then I played a game of Ulix versus, I want to say, Shenlong. And it worked great. And we were like, all right, that seems good. I guess we can kind of test that out with a couple minor things. And eventually, the rush mechanic got added and move values were adjusted. And then there are some things that took a lot longer to change. So pass tokens, I can't remember when that concept kind of came about, but it took us a lot of iterations to kind of get to where we are today. So, yeah.
That's a big change. The pass tokens was a big change. So I would imagine it would take several iterations. What pushed, this is going to, not to make a joke, but what pushed you to make it a push? At what point did charge change from being a move to a push?
It was actually a really kind of basic change. We when looking at second edition games and people were like, I'm going to charge over a fence, we as a design team would kind of look at each other, we're like, how are they charging over fences? This doesn't make sense to us. We were just kind of thinking about it. We're like, from a thematic and visual standpoint, it doesn't really make sense. From a kind of gameplay standpoint, it does. And then with how charges got changed with being 1 AP and allowing you to essentially walk beforehand, we found that rather than going through the fence, going around it seemed like a much more reasonable kind of adjustment. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of kind of watching people play, and especially with new players, watching them and be like, I can charge over fences. I guess that makes sense. And we're like, that seems like a pressure point. Let's see if we can push on that and see where we can go. So
that makes sense. It the other part that kind of changed with charge, and by the way, I like where charge is now, and that is a something that I have encountered a few times already, which is I read it and go, okay, I don't know why we made this change. I don't know how it's going to feel. Like, go into it a little skeptical. 2 games in, I'm like, great idea. Works perfect, feels right. So another change that happened with charge is, originally you had to have a target to charge, right? So you had issues of line of sight and things like that. Now you don't. You can just charge. Do you remember kind of how that evolved?
The original kind of conversation was part of that same looking at the table from a new player's perspective and asking them, can you charge that person? And usually the response is, well, I can't see them, so no. And then we kind of changed it to where they can move around beforehand. And they were like, okay, I kind of move, and then I move again, and then they're right there, so can I attack them? And the answer pretty clearly to us became, it's just more, it's easier for players to grasp the idea of, I can attack after I charge something, instead of charging a specific thing. It also let us do a whole bunch of different kind of mechanical changes and see where things kind of played out. And as we tweaked things, we started to like how it worked better and better. Things with like extended reach. I feel like that existed in second edition. I'm not actually sure at this point. But it felt really good with the kind of non-targeting of charge.
Right.
The only thing I will say that from a design perspective is a little bit annoying is rewording some minor things like disguised and extended reach and how they have to say actions generated by charge. It's still a tiny pressure point that I wish we had found a way to better emphasize that, which there are ways to do it, but it's making sure that gets across and is a really clear-cut thing. Yeah,
I would imagine that desire for elegance must always be pushing you forward and forward. But at some point, if you get a little too fancy, you start losing stuff, right? Things become a little ambiguous.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of elegance was one of those things that I really kind of pushed for when I came on the team, and to make things that one word less. If we can get one word out of this sentence, it'll just be easier. And how far can we go before it starts to just read as gobbledygook that doesn't make any sense? And it was one of those things that with that kind of push, we came up with like the italic cost text, which let us do even more things like paying before you do things. So for the instance of like Leviticus is taking damage before he would do his extra effects, it makes it really easy for us to say, hey, you can't kill yourself by taking damage because that's a cost. And all of those kind of came from these basic ideas. So a lot of people, when they think about game design, they don't necessarily think about all the trickle-down effects that you can get from one core kind of minor change. It's a really big difference with what we're thinking about compared to just the average gamer.
Yeah, and it, I think to a certain degree, it's almost impossible, I would guess, to take the blinders off too, right? Where you guys have been in a room, you've been working on it, and it's got to be hard to look at it with fresh eyes. And sometimes that's really the only thing that's gonna kind of, bring stuff like that out. Which I guess, would lead you to, kind of, now, did you guys have alpha testing with people outside the company?
Yeah, we had a round of alpha testing with a few select people outside of Wyrd, but occasionally we will sometimes bring in like one of our office people or warehouse people and just be like, read this, tell us if it looks weird, because from the perspective of the person who sees it 500 times a day, I'm so used to it that I can't decide about whether or not it makes any sense.
What was the early feedback from the outside alpha testers? Did you get any kind of initial hot takes from them?
The early alpha testers, a lot of what they were testing was the core mechanical changes with newer conditions, new charge rules, and that kind of thing. And it was a very positive experience. The biggest change that we kind of had to get through with the alpha testers was we're changing how crews work. In terms of like any individual crew, it might feel the same, but it's not going to mechanically work the exact same way. We wanted to take every crew and take the thematic kind of what it's doing and its whole purpose in second edition and kind of reinvent it in a cleaner, more elegant way that also uses all these new mechanics and getting people to be on board with we're changing how your models work. Can be a frustrating experience, but it's also a really interesting one to get just ideas thrown back at you and be like, what if you do this? And we're like, oh, that's a great idea. Let's write that down.
It like that's gotta be hard, man. Like if for a designer, let's go to closed beta now, and you guys are in closed beta. What is the hardest part from a designer's point of view in beta testing that maybe isn't obvious to people from the outside?
This is going to sound weird, but it's the not obvious stuff. It's when we make a change to a model that isn't directly based on that individual model's mechanics. It might be based on something way outside of that model that we saw some sort of combination that we were like, that's going to break the game. So we can't do that. Right. The one that I kind of think of, this was an open beta change that a lot of people still kind of question of why it's like this, is the new misery on the woe keyword. They essentially, that ability has the once per activation restriction on it. And I've gotten the question a lot, why is this once per activation? It seems really powerful, but why specifically that? And it mostly comes from Iggy. Because his interactions with the wildfire crew, he essentially created an infinite loop if it wasn't once per activation. So you would walk into a fire pyre and just die of burning immediately. You would immediately take like burning plus 1,000, and then he would walk you out, and you would just be like, okay, I'm done. And so that was, weirdly enough, that was one of those things that we implemented new misery. And then about 5 minutes before we hit publish, I was like, oh crap, I have to fix this right now. Otherwise someone's going to call me on it.
That's funny. I would it's funny you talk about, you think of Iggy in one container, but Iggy, has feats in different containers. And really within faction, we can still hire non-keyword. There's a tax attached to it. One of the things that we lost was mercenaries. And I didn't anticipate that happening, but I wasn't shocked when I saw it, because that had to have been a huge challenge for the, people trying to balance 2E, having people like Johanna that can go with any crew.
Yeah, I feel bad for those people, to be honest. Anyone that worked on second edition and had to balance mercenaries, those were some of the most complicated models that we kind of had to deal with. And the idea of going into third edition and being like, all right, we got really thematic crews and new ideas going on. Let's bring in this random free core trapper from and see how much it can break my crew. And the idea of these mercenaries that kind of show up anywhere, we were like, wow, that's cool and fun. It's really hard to balance, and that model has to be balanced against every model in the game.
Oh, what a nightmare.
Yeah, the kind of parallel thought to that was, we call it the Leviticus problem in the office, was Leviticus had such a huge hiring pool that while those models didn't have to be balanced against every model in the game, Leviticus himself couldn't be too powerful or couldn't have this kind of unique power structure that we wanted him to have in third edition, because he just had access to everything. And so we kept having to kind of look at something and be like, well, is this broken with this other random model from said faction? And all of these things kind of had to be weeded out. And the kind of last of that was weeded out was Zoraida's Enthrall ability, which kind of got cut, I want to say, the really early open beta. We were just like, this, we're done with this. We feel bad for all the players that have a bunch of models that are outside of their thing, but we have to make this change for the good of the game so that we can make more interesting models that don't have to kind of do checks and balances against every faction.
Yeah, the knee-jerk reaction to putting containers around that stuff from a player perspective can be a little rough, because, I've bought a lot of models that I'm not going to use now for out of second edition. But if that sacrifice that I make as a player comes with a better, cleaner game, then I'm okay with it. There's something that a term that we've been using here in the NC meta. Some of the Reser players that I chat with is we used to call it the Nicodem tax, which is you would look to anything undead in Resers, and it would always seem priced a little high for what it did, and it was because Nicodem could summon it, and you guys had to try to balance that. And what that ended up doing is, by keeping Nicodem somewhat balanced because of his powerful summoning, you end up hurting the rest of the faction.
Yeah, we talk about the Nicodem tax in office as well. It's pretty clear to us that problem kind of existed, and that was the main reason why we stopped with this model can summon anything in its faction. We're just like, it's going to summon its keyword models, and they're going to be balanced around it, and everyone's going to play nice. We're not going to have to deal with this one model that is so overly powered, like the Hanged in Nicodem with second edition. We're just like, the Hanged is going to be a Jackdaw model. Why we have to balance it with Nicodem is crazy to us. As designers, we're like, these, while they're in the same faction, they're so different. Well, Jackdaw wasn't in the faction at the time, but we'll say he was a Cry model.
No, I get what you're saying, though.
Yeah, and it was just one of those things that, for the most part, things should be balanced around how they should be played. If they're being played in an obtrusive kind of oppressive way, we want to cut that off at the stem. It's hard to, as a game designer, cut things off, because you want things to kind of flourish and go in new directions, and people will find new ideas and kind of develop new metas, and it'll shift over time. But sometimes you get oppressive kind of new things, and you can't have that. And so a lot of what we were doing was trying to cut it off so that it's never going to happen. If we want something to be balanced around being summoned, it's going to be balanced by being summoned by a specific person rather than any person in Resers, for example.
Yeah, the initial, like I said, the initial reaction is well, he's limiting me, but in reality, it frees you up, right? And it allows you to make real changes to things and not have to temper that across everything. So that makes a ton of sense to me.
A lot of the balance of it comes from the individual models that are being summoned, for instance, because they had to be less than in order to make the other person work. And so we really wanted to highlight everything and have every model kind of have its reason for existing in the world and not be shunted to the bottom of the pack because it costs so ridiculously high because this one minor interaction.
Yep, that makes sense. So let's kind of pull at your memory here a little bit, Matt. Can you think of maybe one or two things that really, from the beginning all the way here to the end, and we're right, like I said, right on the brink of release, what do you think changed the most? We've talked about things that survived, and it's your initial goal. Really made it all the way through. But if someone were going to say what changed the most, and specifically maybe because of the testing, so because of the open beta, I want to get a sense of what the impact of open beta was.
Yeah, so I have two ideas that immediately come to mind. The first one is actually tokens. We came into third edition having cut down all of our conditions And we were basically like, all right, we're going to do a couple of tokens so that we can keep some thematic idea for things like Lynch and Hamlin, so that they can still do the same thing they are doing, and it's not completely doing this new kind of playstyle on them. But originally, tokens existed in so many more places, and we found that as players were playing them, they often found them to just be clutter on the board and a bit more obtrusive. And so every kind of week, we would find a crew and just be like, well, that crew doesn't need tokens, so we're going to rework Dreamer, for instance. He had these dream tokens really early on, and while it was a whole bunch of fun, it was kind of complicated and needlessly cluttering the board. And we were like, how can we have the same effect without him needing to track things? And so while we went from originally we had 20 or so base tokens in the game, I think at this point there are 2 main crews that use tokens kind of in an aggressive way, putting them on enemies, and a couple more that use them for themselves, rather than there used to be 2 or 3 per faction that would do that. So dropping those down a lot was a big change that went kind of from early testing to later testing. The other thing was our upgrade system as a whole. This was not necessarily a change that players noticed. It was one that they kind of didn't notice. With second edition, there were so many upgrades, and it was kind of a core functionality of the game. And then we went into third edition. We were like, upgrades are coming. They'll be here eventually. And here are a couple to keep you situated. And the idea that masters didn't have upgrades anymore, it became almost one of those things that they were getting complicated, but in the best way for us to work with. And the upgrades, as we were looking at them, became kind of needless or too much change to the game.
Yep.
And so the master upgrades kind of just, as we worked on, we realized that they weren't bringing enough to the game, and if they were either too expensive or kind of too much change, that it was really odd and obtrusive to play with.
Yeah, the reality is, Matt, is an upgrade was either stapled or never taken. There wasn't a whole lot of upgrades in 2 that in some situations I take this. The vast majority of them, it's just like, well, just put it on the card, stop with the upgrade, or why even bother printing it? And even though it gave, as a new player, it gave this sense of, flexibility and stuff like that. In reality, after a little while, you didn't do it. And I was one of those players that said, wow, I can't believe they're not doing this. But then I just realized after playing the master, you know what? Molly feels like Molly now. And I don't have 3 cards kicking around to make Molly feel like Molly. And you guys have talked about, potentially having alternate master cards eventually. So I like that direction. I think that ended up being a good choice.
Yeah. Upgrades in second edition, to me, always felt like a trap.
Yep.
You were always like, oh, I did this cool thing, and now I'm just going to play a weaker game because of it. And so we have kind of discussed it briefly in other places with the alternative masters and titles, which exists in a very minor showing people the waters kind of way with like McCabe and some of the ancestor models. They have titles for various game mechanical purposes that make them way easier to write. But with alternate masters, in the future, we would like to kind of revisit the idea of masters that play entirely differently, because that was what the most fun of these upgrades was having 2 different play styles. And we really do want to get that later on, because that was originally in M3's design document. We actually had master upgrades that were stylized. So you would have 4 upgrades per master, and they were in 2 kind of columns. There was a style 1 and a style 2. And then each style had 2 kind of instances, and you could pick so both style 1s of kind of each thing, or go up either tree. So you could kind of have this weird design tree, and it became really fun and really cool, but really complicated. And it was just a lot of cards on the table.
Yeah, I get I'm really impressed because of, the where you guys ended up, because as you know, I'm a fanboy, right? Love the game. As somebody who's been playing miniature games for 15, 20 years, this is, in my opinion, the best game out there. And I think third edition is the best version of this game that I've played. But the one thing that was really tough is the game was intimidating for somebody who was new. And I think that this, and I hate the word simplification, lowering the complexity, unnecessary complexity was a great choice. And one thing that I've noticed, because we have been growing here in the last 6 months in the NC meta, we've almost probably got 30% more players now than we did a year ago, which I know is a little unique, especially for any game making it a changeover. And so I've got a sense of being able to see people that never played 2, and 3 is really their first game of Malifaux. And the biggest thing that I've noticed, Matt, is that when I sit across the table from a new player in 2E, I had to explain everything. So I'm bringing this model. This is what he does. And I'm bringing this model. And this is what he does. And she's got this upgrade. And that's what this upgrade does. What's really cool about what you guys ended up doing is I can just sit back and go, all right, so this is what this crew does. And give, a 2-minute explanation, and not even, maybe I'll call out a model or two, but it gives them a sense of what they're facing. And I think that was like this stealth aspect of this keyword system, and getting rid of the upgrades dominating the game that I would not have guessed until I actually saw it happen.
I find it really funny that you call that kind of a stealth system. All of those things that you kind of just mentioned were very in our head, very upfront for us designing the games. Accessibility from a new player standpoint is really important, especially when you have a game as complicated as Malifaux. Games live and die based on the idea that new players will get into them. And second edition got to the point that it was so complicated, and every single model was so unique, that it was really hard to be like, all right, we're going to sit down and play a game. And now I have to explain 11 models to you, and all of them are so different. And this kind of harkens back to the thematic ability of just being like, hey, Molly uses fading. It does things based on discarding cards. Basically everything else in my crew is going to make me discard cards, and now I'm going to do better and do cool things because of it. You know what I do. That's I'm good. We're good. Yeah. And that's one of those things that we really wanted to focus on. And it came in a lot of ways. Some of it was just kind of bringing in models together, making crews a bit more similar and all having a core function. While also some things were like renaming actions so that they were the same across 2 models. It's just less confusing. So yeah.
No, I agree. And it's simple, small stuff like a great sword's a great sword. That helps a lot. But we've been seeing a lot of the Warmer Hordes community coming over to Malifaux. This is where a lot of our growth has come from. And that's the biggest feedback that we're getting from that, is that they love how deep this game is, but they really love how quickly they've come up to speed on it. So that's an early indication that that you guys have had some good success. So we've had a lot of changes, from 2 to 3. I want to talk a little bit more of that on the other side of the break, man. I want to talk really, I think, some of the major changes and just kind of get your thoughts around it. So we'll be right back. Okay, so now that we, it was really interesting, Matt, to hear kind of that process of testing it. Reading the testing boards and the Facebook messages that fly back and forth. Sometimes I feel like the Iron Man suit that you guys have to wear, not to take things personally, is impressive. So it's just kind of neat to get a feel of that from your side. But I do want to get a little bit specific, and I want to talk about really what I consider kind of the major changes in this new edition. And if you can just kind of talk through some of it, and on the hiring aspect, we really, I think, have dissected keywords pretty well. But there's another big change in hiring. And I want to get a sense of, where this started and why it's still there. Not that I don't think it should be, but how it survived from the initial idea, and that's hiring a master. So the ability to, I have a leader and I can hire a master. Can you walk me through how that started and where it came from?
Yeah, I'm glad you started with the hard question first. So hiring a second master came from a design meeting with a couple of us. Specifically, Kyle was there, and we were kind of talking about how can we introduce some more fun elements to Malifaux that will kind of get people excited about the third edition and bring new things that we haven't seen before. And the idea of throwing up a second master or multi-masters into a crew was one of those that came up. We all kind of looked at each other and we were like, that sounds like a lot of fun. Horribly broken, but a lot of fun. And so we kind of put it on the back burner. And then as we were thinking about it the next couple of days, we're like, we're designing a new edition. We can kind of change up anything we want. Let's see if we can make this not broken in any way. And so we kind of started with give them a cost, start them at some reasonable number. I think the number we started with was 12, and we found really quickly that number was too low. And so we bumped them up to 15, and that seemed to go pretty well. But we still ran into the problems of there were some things that were so unique that masters could do that were just caused huge ripple effects if they were running with a secondary master. And this is where the idea of like leader only abilities kind of came into play. And it let us really kind of tweak and balance individual masters so that not only can you play them in secondary crews, they'll still do well, but they're obviously going to have a difference when they play their own. In terms of balancing them, they kind of fall into different categories. The easiest ones to balance are the ones that rely on their crew a lot to work. Those ones, generally, you're not going to necessarily want to take them as a secondary master. And so it's a lot more of, you can if you want to. They're fun, pretty interesting to kind of play with. And then there are the masters that kind of work a lot more on their own. So Seamus, Lady Justice, those ones. Those are the masters that we kind of had to look at and be like, how do we make these so that if a player wanted to play them, they would not be oppressive in the game. And that was a lot of work on our part. And I feel like we have a pretty good balance on them. Some of them, like Lady Justice, it's just increasing her point cost a little bit. Lady Justice brings so much to a crew, and if she costs 17, it's a really big investment. But is it really going to be 17 stone investment? And so different kind of masters fell into these different places. So one of the things we wanted to work with on these masters is, as they're kind of either too weak or fluffy or too powerful, as we kind of balance them together, we really wanted to get to the point that if you want to take a second master, it can be a competitive choice, but it's never going to be the kind of optimal choice. So we were really working with, if you can get 50 stones in a list, how much effect is a new master going to have when he's kind of out of place? So that it's always like, I'm going to do this because I want to have fun. I'm going to have Molly and Seamus together to bring back that time when Seamus kind of had a control over Molly. Yep. We can see them play in a singular game, because that to us tells a really nice story. But balancing those is always the fun and interesting part. And so playtesting became really important on those individual master things. And a lot of people were like, why not just make it so you can't do that? And we basically decided, well, it's a lot of fun and we feel like we can.
So I got to tell you a secret. I was skeptical, man. When I would say the single thing that I heard when I first came, when open beta, came out, and the first thing I looked at that I just went, this is not going to work, was this aspect. And I felt like you were trying to fix a problem that didn't exist, and you were overcomplicating things. I was super judgmental because I didn't design anything, which makes me smarter than you, right, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely.
But it got play here. We had a pretty active open beta here, and my opinion tempered a bit because I wasn't seeing anybody dominating because of it. Bothered me a little bit that I was seeing the same masters hired, and your examples of Seamus and Lady J are perfect examples. Where you finally got me off of my skepticism is when you had that leader only mechanic put in there. I thought that was an excellent decision. And I appreciate that you guys are thinking this of a, it might be too expensive from a competitive standpoint, but for a fun game, it's going to be a lot of fun. So I like where you guys ended up.
Yeah. I'm very happy with it. I'm excited to see what interesting combinations and things we have. There are some minor abilities that kind of work together that we have. We have some fun, really minor things in the works that you guys will see upon final release. That it's just like a minor tweak. And if you ever see these two masters together, it'll be weird, but it'll be just like this small amount of fun.
That's cool. So I think we talked about a good bit. We talked about, conditions and tokens. There's big changes made there, the consolidation of the conditions, the concept of tokens. So I don't think we need to really dig into that more. And I really picked your brain on charging, but I do want to talk about the changes to wounds and damage output because that was pretty drastic. We saw the number of wounds that models had on average change, and we definitely saw a change in the damage output. So can you walk us through how that ended up being part of the game?
Yeah. So this is one of those that was not as intentional as people think. It kind of became a bit more intentional as we went on. But when we started reworking models for 3rd edition, we kind of had this new balance idea in our mind. And so as these models got rebalanced, we were like, okay, these models play well on the table and they're doing things we want. And as we would hit things, they would kind of fit into that kind of balanced structure. And so as we went along, we were like, okay, so damage is going down a little bit across the board. HP is kind of changing depending on the cost of the model. And so that was one of those things we kind of went in knowing was these kind of core basic balance principles. And the damage profiles changing kind of was just a reflection of us rebalancing things. The major idea behind that coming from we don't want models to die in one activation and die in one hit. It feels really bad for the person playing as that character to just kind of activate and be like, okay, I'm dead. What's next? And so by kind of tempering those numbers just a bit, we saw a pretty big reduction in just flat out destruction of models in one activation. Granted, it still exists in certain places, but it exists in a specific kind of box that we can adjust and work with that is there on a specific purpose. So the Victorias, they're meant to kill things. So.
That's exactly what I was thinking when you talked about it. Yep. There's a lot less feels bad in this edition because of this change, which I like. I have an irrational hatred of the Vix from 2E, and I don't hate him as much in 3. So that's a big deal because I really hated them. I hated that they existed because I literally thought that they were bad for the game, and I don't feel that way anymore. I think they still are killy. I think they still do what they do, but they just don't create that negative play experience like they used to. So I like those changes, man. I think that ended up doing really good things. The upgrades we've talked about. So, really a huge change on the upgrade system. And I think we dissected that. But one thing we haven't really talked about, man, is there's pretty big changes to how terrain works and the terrain rules. Things like, a terrain having a shadow and stuff. I'd be curious to know, where that started and, what was the idea behind making those changes?
Yeah. So where it started was Vantage Point was confusing.
You think?
It was very confusing. Granted, at this point, I couldn't explain Vantage Point to you, but it's been 2 years since I used Vantage Point. But it was really unintuitive, and new players couldn't understand what was happening. And so when we kind of worked with Shadow, we were just like, how can we make this system, while complex and interesting, using not necessarily true line of sight, because true line of sight is just a system that limits our model line, which is something we're really proud of. And it also limits kind of hobbyists to working. So we were like, we can't do true line of sight. What's the kind of next thing we can do? and we kind of came up with the shadow system as a way to it's really easy to, once you figure out what's going on, look at a table and be like, do I have cover? Yes, I'm within 3 inches of this thing, and there's room in the way. So that was one of those instances that it kind of came about of how can we make this as easy as possible to see what is happening on the table. The other big changes with terrain being like concealment and concealing terrain. That was one of those things that we wanted to keep around the negative attacks to modifiers, but kind of lessen it, because shooting in second edition was never as good as melee combat. And we wanted projectile-based crews to feel good and feel powerful. And so if we limited that negative twist to attack modifiers to more concealing terrain, which is a lot less common on boards, then it's a weird balance change that has nothing to do with the individual models, but is more the terrain of the table, because cover is less oppressive to them. So that was one of those big things that we just working on it from a visual standpoint, what's easiest to use and easiest to understand, and then also how does this affect gun lines, and because terrain doesn't have as much of an impact on melee crews as it does those that pack a bunch of gunpowder in their pockets.
Yep. No, that makes sense. It's funny about the shadow rule. I have the hardest time explaining it to people that have played Malifaux before. If someone has never played Malifaux before, makes total sense. But if they played 2E, they're like, wait, what? So
yeah,
that's a sign that I think you did the right thing there.
Yeah, that is actually a thing that kind of shows up a lot of second edition players getting confused with third edition. One of the biggest kind of hurdles we have designing third edition was making sure that the communication is for new players and for players that are already in the game. Because those are the ones that have supported us for the longest time. We want to make sure that they kind of get the extent of the game. But Shadow is just one of those things that you kind of have to go for the easy solution that new players understand, because it's a really complicated topic.
Yeah. The whole concept of terrain and line of sight and all of that is something that model companies, miniature game designers have been tackling for forever. And the one thing that was good about GW's approach of true line of sight is it simplified things. I'm really glad you guys didn't do it, because I hate it.
True line of sight. So from a perspective of a game designer, I weirdly think of my job is not to make the best game possible. It's to make the game that gets models on the table and that excites people about the model line, because to us those are what's super important. We love our game, and as a game designer, that is really my kind of forte. But if no one wants to buy the models, then why the game is never going to be played. And modelers love their weird bases and their changing up things, and true line of sight just cuts that to the ground. You can't really adjust the height of models with true line of sight. And so it's one of those game mechanics that is a modeler's nightmare.
No, I'm really happy you guys didn't go in that direction. So the last thing, and I've heard rumbles about this, but is Gaining Grounds going to exist in third edition? Yeah,
Gaining Grounds is going to exist in third edition. We're starting season 1 in the first couple of months after release, hopefully. We'll get some playtesting started on that. That's going to do a couple minor things. If we need to make adjustments to schemes and strategies, initially that's where that's going to come in. It's also going to allow us to kind of change up things and allow us a bit more freedom from what we've seen in the first couple months to going forward. Adjust minor things, and we're really excited about it. I can't talk too much into what's going to be in the first season of Gaining Grounds. But I will say that we have some pretty exciting plans that we think will add new aspects to the game and bring some exciting new changes.
Yeah, something to look forward to. I like that. All right. So the last thing I want to kind of learn from you is, we're a couple months now that, a good number of people have been playing the game. You've got podcasts like this one, Schemes of Stones, and the Scoundrels out there that have been talking about the game. You got a lot of people posting, different things about the game. I want to know, how does that feel as a designer? Like when, say, Steven comes on my show and talks about Molly, and, you listen to somebody who didn't design it, you designed it, and they talk about it. I've always wondered what it must be like to hear somebody talk about your baby.
Yeah. So I will say this out loud. I listen to every podcast players put out. Anything that has Malifaux, the other side, Wyrd related. Even if you just put it in your description, I'll probably listen to it. I'm really excited about it. And so when I heard you guys talking about Molly last week, 2 weeks ago or something, I was just really excited because that was one of those things that I had a lot of my hands in Molly, especially later on, and hearing you guys talk about things that I had never thought of was just so interesting. Because you guys specifically came up how mobile Molly's crew was. And I was like, I know Molly's crew is super mobile, but a lot of it for me came in the form of like night terrors and summoning night terrors with a Forgotten Marshal to kind of push them around and do a lot of things with that. And so when you're like, I never take night terrors, I'm like, oh no, what about night terrors? And so just kind of hearing players talk about different things from a more open kind of dialogue rather than just forums, we learned so much stuff that we never would have thought about. And so I only hope that I hear about something. I never hear about anything that's like, here's a game-breaking thing that never got brought up. I just like, please don't say anything along those lines. And I like to think that didn't come up in that conversation. I don't think anything was too bad.
It didn't. And Steven was very open about the fact that, this is his early take too. So even though he's gotten 15, 20 games in with Molly, he fully recognizes that, what he talked about on that episode could change 6 months from now. And I think that's what's kind of the most exciting thing about it. We're going to be releasing an episode with James Doxey talking about Karis. Was another deep dive.
I'm excited about it.
I was, oh man, it was so good. I was fascinated because, I did my homework on Karis before the episode, and he went in directions I never thought about. And I can imagine that that's only a small taste of what you went through.
Yeah. And it comes from like a podcast, but also like Karis, for example. I played a game the first time I had ever played like the current iteration of Karis. I was like, let's see how this goes. And I spent my first turn. I was like, what am I supposed to be doing again? And then suddenly it clicked, and I was just like, oh yeah, this is all the things I had planned out in my design like idea and head. Let's see how this goes. And it was tons of fun. And it's always like, I really want to hear from players, like, what is the most fun aspect of those crews? And the Molly example, only because it's kind of fresh on my mind, it was one of those things that it's interesting to hear if you talk about something or if you don't, because the fading mechanic never was brought up in that conversation.
Yeah.
And to me, that was it's the most fun mechanic in her crew. It's definitely what makes any individual turn fun and kind of exciting for both players. And so it's just interesting seeing everyone's kind of reactions to it. What's the most powerful thing compared to what's the most fun thing, which are what I'm excited about personally.
Yeah, I mean, when I read about Molly before I played her, the fading thing totally dominated my thought process, and I ended up being a little bit more like Steven, where fading happened, but it wasn't the central piece of her for me. But and this we'll wrap this up here. But somebody asked me after my first couple games. In fact, I even think I did a podcast about my first game with Molly. What I thought was so cool about, and I'm so glad my first game of Malifaux 3rd Edition was with her, is my hot takes were, it felt like Molly, even though she played nothing like she did in 2nd Edition. And not only that, but she played like a master that I'd never played with before. Like, it was a totally new experience, but it was still Molly. And that probably was the biggest compliment. And what drove me to record that podcast about my first hot take is that, like, the fact that I had all of those feelings at the same time after my first game with, the first master that I tried, it was really encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take that as a personal compliment to myself.
No, it was all you. It was all you.
I love Molly so much. So I personally don't even play Molly, but I just love her mechanics. I think she's a lot of fun. So
Yeah, I think fun is the right word, man. Fun is definitely the right word. All right, so to wrap up, Matt, can you just give me an idea that if 6-8 months from now, what would you love to hear everybody talking about to make you feel like this was a success?
I want everyone to talk about a different thing. If I hear every Master's name, that's what I'm excited for.
Neat.
I really want people to be like, oh, I love Molly, or I love Karis, or I love Ma Tucket. I want to hear Ma Tucket eventually.
Yep.
But I will consider myself truly excited if I can get a couple masters out of each faction and not have people like super power gaming and be like, well, this is the best model and you should always take it. And it's not meant for this in any way. So
you're going to get that, Matt. That's unavoidable. People figure a game out. And that used to really bother me actually, because, this is going to be a huge shocker to all my listeners. I'm not good at this game, nor am I good at any game I play. And the min-maxing, power gamer stuff used to really bother me, but now I kind of realize, when you set up a set of rules and you create something as complicated as Malifaux or any other miniature game, people are going to find, the path. They're gonna figure the game out. What I think is great is, and you guys did it in second edition, and I look forward to seeing it in the third edition, is regular changes and gaining grounds. I think are what allow you to stop those from dominating the game and turning it into, that's what Malifaux is. And I think that some of the design choices you guys made, specifically the keyword system, which if you haven't picked up on, I like, I think that is going to help a lot. So, but I like that, Matt. I like that you just want to hear about all kinds of different models and masters. That's very, very cool. All right. So I want you to know that I'm going to be bugging you again soon, Matt. I really enjoyed this, and I know our listeners have loved kind of pulling back the curtain. So I hope you come back, and I'd like to talk Kyle and some of the other people to come on. So can't thank you enough, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Love being here. It was a great time.
All right, everybody take care. Thanks for listening. Be sure to rate and write a review on this podcast so we can find more people almost as cool as you are. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube by searching for Third Floor Wars. That's THIRD. We'll catch you next time on the Third